Our presenter, Dan Diadana, began his 20-year career at the Holland Sentinel as a staff writer and worked his way up and was promoted to his current position as sports editor for the publication. He is also the managing editor of a monthly publication, Swimming World Magazine. A 2003 graduate of Central Michigan University, he holds a BA degree in journalism. Dan has received several awards and commendations from the Michigan Press Association and the Associated Press. He was recently named the top sports columnist in the state by the Michigan Press Association. Dan and his wife and two daughters live here in Holland, and the whole family traveled to Paris this summer to attend some of the Olympic events. So with that, I'll turn the microphone and camera over to Dan Diadana.
Thanks, Tom. So before I get going, just a little bit more on my background, so you know exactly where I fit into some of this history that we're talking about. So, like Tom said, I graduated from Central in 2003. I did some freelance work at the Ann Arbor News when I was still looking for a job. And then I got my job here in Holland a little over 20 years ago, which seems crazy. But when I see parents of, kids that I wrote about a few years back, maybe not so crazy. But I've done everything from page design to everything else, photographs, columns, sports writing. I was a news reporter for one summer. That was different. I'm not a fan of 9 to 5 days and nice slacks. So that summer was the end of that. Although it was an election year, and I got to cover Obama being here, which is pretty fun. You don't often get an opportunity like that, so definitely worth it. I've been at Swimming World Magazine as my side hustle. It is a monthly. I got my first cover story framed down here, so it is it's a side hustle. It's a monthly print magazine, but it's also constantly online. So I basically have 2 full-time jobs. It's allowed me to do a lot of cool things, but it also has brought me into the magazine world, which is very different. And then I have authored 2 books that I brought down here too. In Cobb's Shadow, the Hall of Fame careers of Sam Crawford, Harry Heilman, and Heidi Manouche, about 3 old Detroit Tiger Hall of Famers, and Golden Glow, how Caitlin Sandino achieved gold in the pool and in life, from my swimming side of things. So, that's just to show books, magazines, newspapers, online. There's not much I haven't touched in my 20 plus years as a journalist. So, a lot of different changes that have happened since I started. When I started as a journalist, I did not have a cell phone. That's probably been the biggest difference, only for about 6 months. And then that's when that craze started. So I can only imagine what newspaper reporters used to have to go through, which we'll go through, before all of that technology and computers and, smoke signals and whatever else they had to do. So, but yeah, so I'm presenting on the history of sports writing. We'll talk a little bit about, just kind of the evolution of sports along with the media. And then we'll I'll get into certain topics where things got different. Different eras covered things differently, did things differently. It has kind of evolved as sports and as America. I mean, I guess globally too, but I'm sticking to America in this presentation has evolved. And it's been, looking back, it's been extremely different. So, so we'll kind of start. Sports, have kind of always been around. You guys, probably seen Gladiator and stuff like that. Movies of old sports. Technically, I'm glad we don't do the to the death thing around here. That would be I wouldn't be up here. I would have lost in the 8th grade. And that was my peak of my that was the peak of my sports when I was an 8th grade pitcher. I threw a no-hitter, and that was the best I ever got. Faced the same team the next week, and they clobbered me. So that was about the end of that. So, but they've always been around. You know, there's, you know, the old Mayan ruins have like sports courts that were kind of like a basketball lacrosse mix. Indigenous people here played lacrosse and other stuff. You got, you know, sports where there was always athletic activity around. Even, you know, as long as there were hunting tools, there were, I'm sure, you know, there were competitions that ended up arising with that, archery and spear throwing and whatever else, which gave us the Olympics. Again, glad there's not live targets or anything like that now. It'd be a much different way of covering. I can't imagine if there were journalists back then. You know, an unfair word to you would had you, you know, you'd be the next victim in the Coliseum, maybe. So, but in the United States, when we're talking about organized sports, you know, that really started to take off. The first one was baseball, and it was, you know, in the mid 1800s, the Civil War soldiers played baseball. It spread. That's how it really spread. Outside of, you know, the far northeast. It started in the New York area. Brooklyn and New York had teams. The Knickerbockers, right here, the Knickerbockers were one of the teams. The Brooklyn Excelsiors. I wish they would bring some of those names back, I have to say. Cleveland Guardians, no thanks. Well, doesn't the Cleveland Excelsiors sound so much better? I mean, the Guardians, are they their legal guardians? I don't know. See, there's too many jokes with that name. I just don't like it. But anyway, so baseball was the thing, and it became after the Civil War, it really spread all over the country. People started to play it. There's different areas had slightly different rules. They had, you know, you kind of assimilated wherever you were, and it became this phenomenon, especially in the New York area. They played across the river in New Jersey for the most part, in view of however the skyline of Manhattan looked in, you know, in 1858. But that was the thing. Baseball became this thing. They would go out, people would go out of the city. They'd just sit at the park and they'd watch this, and they would play weekly games. And then it was this curiosity factor. And as any journalist will tell you, curiosity is what keeps us employed. So that people wanted to know more about this. What is this game that is being played? Why are there so many people watching it? How has no one died with this big wooden club they're using? You know, all these kind of questions. So we're looking here at Henry Chadwick. Henry Chadwick is the godfather of sports writing. He was a journalist born in Great Britain, and came over when he was younger and was an expert at cricket, which was kind of a somewhat of a precursor to baseball. It had some elements that was to it, but he enjoyed that sport and started watching when his job. He worked for Brooklyn's newspaper as a news reporter, and baseball became such this phenomenon that he's like, I need to go check this out. And so he went and watched the games, and like many of us, seeing our first baseball game, was captivated by it. And he wanted to know more. He wanted to the first part of his job was just telling people when and where these games were. This is what's going on. Everybody wanted to know what this phenomenon was. He was the one. You would read him and he would say, the game is here at this time, come on down. And they started getting so big a crowds, they started charging attendance, which obviously changed the game quite a bit, made it more of a professional type game. But then he started reporting on the games. He was one of the first to really report on the games as far as what happened on the field, who won, how they won, why is the pitcher pitching underhand, all these kind of things. And he also developed the box score, which reporters still use today. This is back in the 1850s, early 1860s. So Henry Chadwick developed the box score so we could, because he was getting questions and he had questions himself, like, is this guy better than this guy? You know, what team is better? What players are better? What are they really doing? This guy hits the ball a ton, but they seem to catch it every time. You know, kind of comparing what was going on. So he's the first person to calculate batting average as a statistic, and runs scored, and hits, and we've added things as he went, and as you know everything else went. Now they you could look up a statistic for what left-handed pitcher has the most wins on a rain out day, you know, or on a day that was a rain delay. You know, there's so many statistics now that some of them that you just shake your head at, and some of them that you just, you know, have to, you know, have some sort of advanced degree to calculate. But it all started with Henry Chadwick, and he is the only sports writer that is in the Baseball Hall of Fame as a Hall of Famer. They have a award that goes out to writers and broadcasters that some of the writers and broadcasters from Detroit have won. You know, Ernie Harwell won the broadcasting award. Joe Falls and Tom Gage that covered the Tigers have won the writing award, but those are awards, there's no writers wing of the Hall of Fame. It's an award. But Henry Chadwick is in the Hall of Fame. He is basically, they call him the godfather of baseball because he made it even more compelling than just watching the game, because now you know what to look for, you know what to watch for, you know who's better on paper. You know what an upset is now and what an underdog is now, because you know who's supposed to be better in these situations. And he almost single-handedly made sports compelling to the masses in the United States, which is incredible when you think about the timing of this. You know, this is back when, you know, people read only the newspaper. There was no radio, there was no TV, there was no internet, there were no phones, there was no cars. And he, you know, you got the news one way or another. Some people didn't get his stories until, you know, weeks later because of where they lived. And if you didn't live in Brooklyn, where he was, you had to, you know, that's why the Associated Press was formed. Stuff like that is that you would, you know, be able to send stories different places. So he didn't have to go, if there was something in California, he didn't have to travel by train or coach across the country, taking a month to get there. So that's kind of how that syndication came into play eventually, with sports. But everything TV, radio, everything that has come out of sports is owed to Henry Chadwick, because he is the one that made all of it happen, made all of it relevant, and made all of it exciting and understandable. That's also a key too. If you go to a game once and you don't understand it, you read up and then you figure it out. If you don't understand it by the end of the second game, you're disinterested and you are gone. You know, that's a waste of time at that point. So he also made it understandable, which is a big thing, because, you know, if you try to explain baseball, or I say it in football, try to explain football to somebody, American football, excuse me, try to explain American football to somebody from the Sudan. When you're talking about downs and, you know, oh, it's how many downs till you get a certain yards, and you get more downs, and what's a down? And then you score a touchdown. It's, first of all, it's football, but it's nobody uses their foot except the kicker, right? So you got to explain that to them. And then what a down is. And then if they score a touchdown, they kick an extra point, 1 point. I don't know why. But you can go for 2, which is another thing. It's like, I feel like that's like on the playground rules, where some kids like, if I do it this way, I get 2 points. Or a field goal's 3 points. How do you even determine all of that? Like, it's impossible to explain to somebody that has never experienced it, because it's so strange. So that's what Henry Chadwick was doing to everybody, because baseball was completely different than everything. there was a diamond. Cricket, you would hit with a flat bat and you'd run back and forth, and the game might take a week. This game has some elements of cricket, but you're dealing with different things now. And it just changed. Like in cricket, the bowler, not the pitcher, the bowler is trying to get the hitter out. But at the start of baseball, the pitcher threw underhand, and the batter could say where they wanted it. I want a high pitch, or I want a low pitch. I want it whatever. The point was to let them hit the ball and let the excitement happen. Strikeouts were boring, so you didn't want that. So games often were like 40-30 because there were no strikeouts. You only got 3 innings in before dark, which is kind of like cricket, but and then they would just continue on. Some cricket champion matches have gone like 5 days, which is incredible. I don't even have the attention span for that, but that's kind of how things got going. And then obviously the pitching changed. The pitchers, they started throwing overhand, the mound went further back, and they started striking people out, and pitchers started throwing 100 miles an hour, and everybody's like, "Ooh, this is exciting." And now if you could watch the current game, I would argue it's too many strikeouts. But that's just me. I like exciting plays. I think home runs are boring, full disclosure. They're exciting for half a second, and then that's it. I would much rather have a double or a triple with 2 people on base where everybody's moving, everybody's running, everybody's involved, and you got to think. That's the best part about baseball is what's going to happen when the ball gets hit. You start thinking, okay, they're going to get it. How fast are they going to get it? How fast is the runner? How good's this guy's arm? How fast is this other runner? How are they going to? This is baseball. This is home runs and strikeouts and walks. There's no thinking. So the fans have to get to stop thinking, which I don't know, maybe good for modern fans. I have no idea, but I would much rather have this all going. That's the excitement for me. One of my many tangents. Sorry. So then, and I'm not a professional speaker, so I got my notes up here. I'm a professional note taker, so hopefully these are okay. My notes, I just don't want to forget anything. So, okay. So then, when Chadwick and his writers of his time were started to get the hang of it now, right? We're a few years in to baseball being a thing. People know what statistics are. People know what baseball is. People know what the object is. The games had a writing style of the Walt Whitman era. This is the Walt Whitman era. A lot of games were written like an old poem or like a fairy tale. If you go back and read a game description from this time, you just think first of all, you'll probably think it's ridiculous, but it's amazing how it just goes with the time. And we will talk about how that keeps going throughout sports. But that was, the time where people read poetry on the regular back then. That is not really the case now. But fairy tales were the form of entertainment. There was no TV, there was no radio. Books were it. Newspaper was the news, books were the entertainment. And any book that wasn't the Bible really was kind of a fairy tale or a book of poems back then. So the baseball games were written as this heroic Lancelot type thing, this amazing clout that traveled through the clouds and landed safely in the farmer's barn and whatever, and allowed the Excelsiors to be triumphant. Or it was. If you read it now, you would, I guess, what I would say in the business, we would say it was more than 100% overwritten. But that was kind of the style of things. It was more of the fairy tale of the story. It was the story, the journey, trying to get you to be entertained, because that's, again, books were either poetry or fairy tales for the most part. That wasn't the Bible. The Bible can be entertaining. The Bible also was what everybody read on Sundays and every other day probably back then, and what was the guidelines for life. So they weren't really looking to that for entertainment. Wasn't it so exciting when Abraham almost killed his kid? Like it's not the same kind of entertainment. So that's how that kind of went with baseball, but it got everybody thinking of baseball as a fairy tale, which is incredible, but it was necessary to get people interested back then because that's the way it went. That was your only form of entertainment, was that kind of a feeling, as we didn't have many mediums at that point. So yeah, so we'll move past this. We don't need to be staring at two hairy beards here. So maybe not. Oh, here. Okay. All right. So this is Ring Lardner. Things started to change after the turn of the century. Things got different. We had obviously we had the Industrial Revolution. Society changed. We started to have cars kind of, for a little bit. And then the industry grew. Baseball grew huge. Sorry if any of you guys hate baseball, I apologize, but it's all we had for a long time in this. We'll get to some other sports as we go. But baseball grew. The National League started in 1876. We had, still traveled by trains, all that kind of stuff. The American League was born in 1901. So that's when kind of modern, as people would say, modern baseball started, where you had the American National League. You started to have, you started to move a little bit away from the fairy tale because baseball was so much more popular now that people would see it. The teams started popping up in the back in Henry Chatter's time, 1850s, 60s, even in the 70s. It was also like kind of like an anomaly. Like if you heard, if you lived in Holland and you heard, the Brooklyn Excelsior's baseball club was coming to Grand Rapids, you're going. Everybody from Michigan's going. There's nothing like it. It's like if the Traveling Circus was in town, or, like today, if Taylor Swift was in town, or whatever, people are going. So you had that thing. And then that started, as the game started to spread, town teams popped up, company teams popped up. So you wouldn't have to go to Grand Rapids to ever see your first ball game, because Hope College would have a team, or the Holland Dutchman would have a town team, or stuff like that. You had different companies. Herman Miller might have had a team, had a team that would play something like that if it was, kind of today. They're not Herman Miller anymore, though, are they? So you know what I'm saying. So but those would be the kind of the big like there would be factory teams, there would be town teams. Sometimes the factory teams would play the town team. But anyway, you had baseball itself. You might not have had the superstars or the major leagues or even the minor leagues, but you had organized baseball. Almost every town had at least a team that you would go. Holland would take on Zeeland, and they would play, and it would be this huge thing. And it would be like the weekend event, the summer event, or whatever. And so baseball was in everybody's town now. So people knew, so they wanted to know more about the game, but also more about the players. The first wave was more about the game and the fairy tale of the game. Now we get to the mid, as we approach the 20s, we've got, some superstars in the game. We've got Ty Cobb, we've got Honus Wagner, you've got people are interested in stories of people. And that's when sports journalism started to change, with people like Ring Lardner and Damon Runyon. And they started to tell the stories of the heroes. So it was still kind of a fairy tale. It kept that kind of stuff, but it was more about the person, the player, than the event. So if Ty Cobb hit an inside the park home run or whatever, the story would describe all that kind of stuff, but it would also start to get into more depth about Ty Cobb. What was he thinking going around the bases? Quotes started to come into play. Early sports writing had no quotes from the players, even here until Babe Ruth. We really didn't, there wasn't a ton of quoted information, which was really hard when I was doing this book, because Sam Crawford played for the Tigers from like 1899 to 1917. He's probably quoted in the Detroit Free Press like 4 times in his career. And he was, one of the 5 best players in the game at his time. So that's really shows you how much things have changed now. I mean, I can't go to an event without trying to talk to as many people as I can to tell the story. So it kind of started with Ty Cobb and Honus Wagner, and it started to move up. But then we got this guy, Babe Ruth, who changed everything. He changed everything. It only took, I mean, he started off as a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox, and he was the best left-handed pitcher in the game, which not a lot of people know or remember. Well, not remember anymore. Not nobody was around back then. But for 8 years or so, he was the best left-handed pitcher in the game and led the Boston Red Sox to a couple World Series. And then most people know the story of how he got sold to the Yankees. And then there was the curse of Babe Ruth till 2004, when the Red Sox finally won for the first time since selling him. Although, as wonderful as that is, I would tell you that it wasn't the curse of Babe Ruth. It was the curse of they were by far the last team to hire a black guy. And that's why they were cursed. They could have had Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays on their team. They had tryouts and didn't give it to them. So that's really the curse. There's no curse of Babe Ruth, if you ask me. But anyway, he was one of the best pitchers in the game. He was different looking than the other ball players. A lot of the ball players were they were either just regular looking people like myself. I'd like to think I'm regular looking. You can keep your opinions to yourself on that. But like, it wasn't like and then you started to get you get some guys that look like athletes, like Honus Wagner was, he had very broad shoulders. Ty Cobb looked like a regular guy. Babe Ruth was neither. He has, as you can see, he's got a big head, big facial features. He's got broad shoulders, but he went down like this. He had the skinniest legs in the major leagues. I don't know how he didn't fall over when he was running. But it was like, those kids things where you different animals where you have like the different feet and the different midsection of the different head. That's what he is. And it's like they swap the legs right out and then they put Ty Cobb's legs on him. I don't know. It was the weirdest thing, but as a pitcher, it made him look different and it made him throw different. But his legs were strong enough, obviously, but he was able to throw harder than a lot of people because he had this strong upper body. And so that was interesting. And he led Boston to some World Series. That was interesting. Then every once in a while, he would hit the ball and you'd be like, where did that go? And then that started the captivation. He got sold to the Yankees. He started his hitting in Boston still, even though it really became famous in New York. He got there. They were like, everybody's talking about where these balls are ending up that you keep hitting. We got enough pitchers. You're going to play the outfield. And he, I think this first 3 years on the Yankees, he had more homers than all the other teams did. He had like 29 homers one year, and the Tigers had 18. Stuff like that as a team, because the game hadn't changed that way yet, and it would. And then the next year, in 26 or 27, he had 60 homers, and it's just mind-boggling because 8 years before, Ty Cobb won the Triple Crown when he had led the league in home runs with 9. And here's somebody hitting 60. And then they built Yankee Stadium, aptly the house that Ruth built, is the way they talked about it. It changed the game overnight. Now, when you're doing a story about a kind of a hero-y story about somebody like Babe Ruth, he'll do that every day, right? He'll hit a home run almost every day, at least one. There's something legendary that he would do almost every day. It changed the way sports writing was, because the way you used to write about players and write about teams, you have written all of that in 2 weeks covering him. Now you got to come up with some other stuff. And this was the first time, the first era of sports writers where you had to find things. You had to find things to write about, because, and not only did you have to find things to write about, you had to find things to write about Ruth, because everybody wanted to know everything about Ruth. You already knew he could hit the ball further than anybody else, more often than anybody else. He was funny looking, and boy, could he hit the ball a ton. Now what, right? So there are some crazy stories, that we'll talk about, like, you know, why, how the crooked finger on his left hand helped him do, like stuff. There's just everything, because he moved to the Yankees. His first full year with the Yankees was like 1921. He played until like 1936. So that's a lot of copy that's a lot of years of copy you got to fill. So you had the legendary stuff, you had him predicting stuff, you had stories about how far he thinks he could hit a ball, and they still barnstormed at this time, and you had to New York papers followed him through Iowa for these exhibition games. How many cows can he hit it over? Like all these kind of things, because everybody wanted to know everything about Babe Ruth. It was a scoop when you could get something different, even if it was, oh my gosh, his cap size went up to 7 from 6 7/8. I wonder how that's going to affect his home run. Boom, there's a story. Like anything and everything. So then some of the off-field stuff became big with Ruth. Writers would go out with him. Like they would watch him do all kinds of crazy stuff, whether it be participate in the rodeo that was in town, or anything like that. He started to get some he had film crews following him at times and stuff, so there was things there. It was just everything. They wanted to know everything about him, and no one else mattered. No one else mattered for a while, because it was so different and it was so captivating. The game never had somebody. And oh, by the way, when Ty Cobb hit 9 home runs, they were all inside the park home runs. This was not, he didn't slug 9 over the fence, maybe one. So, and here's Babe Ruth that hit 60 over the fence. It changed everything. No one wanted to hear about these little hitters that couldn't hit it that far anymore for a while. And, it just changed everything. So, so writers started writing more columns too around here. The opinion came out, and it was more of a, what could this guy do? What couldn't this guy do? You should, I mean, there'll be stories about, I watched him eat a 64-ounce steak. What can't he do? Everything. They wanted to know everything about him. And then that started to spread. If you already know everything about Babe Ruth, now he's got this teammate named Lou Gehrig that is just about as good as him, although he never pitched. And, let's learn everything about him. And everyone quickly found out that Lou Gehrig was boring. So that was a little tougher, but that made you dig as a sports writer. You're going from somebody that's the most colorful character in the history of America to the straightest mama's boy, goody two shoes, major professional athlete that ever lived. And they batted one after the other on the same team for a decade. And it was just, so then there was a lot of reporting, comparing and contrasting them, and just whatever. And and then as Ruth started to, I don't even know about fade, but then is Gehrig better than Ruth, and all that kind of stuff. And then of course the most goody two shoes, boring copy ended up having the biggest story in like the history of baseball at the time, and for a long time until integration, is when he had Lou Gehrig's disease, and he died in the middle of his career. And that is very ironic when you think about how plain that, the movie about him could have been called Lou Plain and Tall, like it was just, there was nothing to say. He got in, he didn't talk to Ruth for 2 years because Ruth said something off color about Gehrig's mom, and they didn't talk for 2 years after that. Like that was the extent of the color that Lou Gehrig showed. But then the game started to have, writers started to look for those, more stories, more, who's got this, who's got that. There's while Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig are doing the thing in the American League, the National League's like, hey, don't forget about us. We got this guy, Rogers Hornsby, who hit 400 for 5 straight years. That's insanity. If you think about, if you know baseball, you hit 300, you're great. But he averaged 400 for a 5-year period and actually hit 400 for 3 or 4 of those 5 years. Won the Triple Crown. But again, he was also, oh my gosh, he wouldn't drink anything heavier than a milkshake. He wouldn't go to the movies because he was afraid it was going to mess his eyes up. He did nothing but hit, go to the batting cage, and just practice. And he was fantastic, but he was boring. That, for the first time, that changed the, sports writing, is that we had to find the stories now. From when baseball started to Babe Ruth, the stories found us. Now we have to go out and find the stories, and it really showed who could dig up, the right things and the good stories. So that's where we are. But this is, Babe Ruth started kind of the age of heroes. We didn't have this. Everything was like a hero worship writing. Wasn't Babe Ruth so great? He hit it a mile, and it's still going because we didn't see it fall, stuff like that. You had Jack Dempsey was the first big time boxer that the whole nation knew, heavyweight champion. You had Bill Tilden in tennis, became the first like real tennis player that anybody knew. The 1920s were the age of heroes, but it also was it was the age of everything, the age of excess. It was the age of ballyhoo. It was the, it was everything. Everything was done big. Dancing was done big. Drinking was done big. Sports were done big. Everything was a hero celebration, basically. And then you have that throughout all the sports, and it was great until you knew everything about everybody. There gets to a point where you already know this now. Everybody knew about Babe Ruth. Everybody knew about Jack Dempsey. Everybody knew. So then what? So then you got to start digging deeper into stories. The 30s became a dig deeper. You started to have different things pop up. One of the most famous stories, we got Jesse Owens here, is Jesse Owens winning a bunch of gold medals literally in Hitler's face. That was a huge, huge story. To me, even though I'm a swim guy, to me, Michael Phelps can do whatever he wants. Jesse Owens is the greatest Olympian that ever lived, because Michael Phelps didn't have to win all those gold medals in Hitler's face with Hitler staring down at him, not knowing if there's going to be some secret police that did something at the end of the Olympics. They knew that nothing was going to happen during the Olympics because that would mess up his entire plan of showing how great Germany was and then taking over everybody. If the timeline got messed up, maybe we would have stepped in earlier, and that would have been, yeah. Okay, so the question is, how did Hitler respond to Jesse Owens? He didn't like Jesse Owens. That's not a secret. He was supposed to shake everybody's hand who won the gold medal. He would not shake Jesse Owens' hand, but he got out of it by saying he wasn't going to shake anybody's hand. So he probably shook the hand of the track stars that won the first day or whatever. I don't remember what day Jesse's was, but once Jesse Owens won, he stopped shaking everyone's hand, so they couldn't just say he wasn't going to shake Jesse Owens' hand. But that definitely was a big. It obviously was a big thwart in what Hitler was trying to propagandize, if that's a word, to everybody. So yeah, and Jesse Owens was scared. I mean, like he didn't want to meet Hitler, and then he was offended that Hitler wouldn't shake his hand, and then he was grateful he never had to shake his hand. So like there's a lot of things that went into that. But here for the first time, we're really dealing with a non-white athlete in the middle of something. I mean, we had Jack Johnson, the boxer, in the 1890s and early 1900s, but that was still a different time when boxing wasn't quite as big as some of the other sports, and it wasn't as nationally known as when we got to the 20s and we, started to have this hero thing. It was more like, you've heard the phrase, the Great White Hope. That was what all the boxers were between Jack Johnson and Jack Dempsey, trying to basically beat the black guy and be the champion. But no one really knew anything about Jack Johnson. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't really an anti-hero either, but it wasn't big enough. This was big enough. This was global now, on the global stage. And this changed things too, because the reporters, as whatever you want to say about the reporters or the media, usually in things of race and diversity and stuff like that, reporters usually lead the charge. We don't trail the charge. You don't know that how big of a thing stuff is until it's in the papers or whatever, back then at least, especially. So this was a big moment where it started off. First of all, just what he did was amazing, right? I mean, we can all agree that was one of the biggest things that's ever happened for the US. But he not only did he do this opened up all these other questions. Now he started the conversation about, should baseball be integrated? He started the conversation about, should the military be integrated? He started the conversation about equality amongst races in the US, because they saw what he did. And as we've seen in racial issues, unfortunately, in racial issues throughout history, somebody has to go that far into greatness to get people to get this equality part back here. Like, where equality in the military should be a very easy, basic thing. And he had to do all of this in Hitler's face for us to start talking about it. And the same thing in baseball, and the same thing in everything. You started questioning everything at this point. And the 30s also brought on, we had for a few times already, the female Olympians from the US. That was not a thing from the very beginning. And they finally got into the mainstream about this time as well. And so we have started having all those questions about things. Should there be female leagues of sports? Should there be, women be able to go professional in track too after the, stuff like that. So the 30s was really the starting of the age of questioning from reporters about, and bigger issues. It wasn't just, oh, he won. It was, and that it was amazing. He won and it was amazing. They wrote it as big as a deal as it was, but then it kept going. The story kept going into new questions about what's next. What does this mean? That's the thing I ask everybody, almost every interview I do with anybody. What does this mean to you? What does this mean right now? What is this? And then that leads to more things. So this is the first time that journalism really led in a look at other things, and what's next, and what does this mean. And then we've got Joe Louis here too. Same thing. He had 3 really big fights around the same time. 2 of them were against Max Schmeling, who was a German. This was a big propaganda fight where the Nazis did the same thing, where Hitler was like, our our white guy's going to beat your black guy, basically, because whites are superior. And he did. He beat Joe Louis. It was his only loss until the very end of his career when he came out of retirement to fight Rocky Marciano. So it became this bigger than the story still is. This was not just a boxing story. It was American versus Nazi. It was this kind of. And I will say, as much as I feel for obviously Joe Louis in his situation, he came back and beat Max Schmeling the next time they had a rematch and he beat him. Max Schmeling really got thrown in the middle of that. Not a Nazi. People thought he was a Nazi. He's from Germany. So like they touted him as a hero. He kind of played the hero a little bit, like where he would go to like dignitary events in Germany and stuff. So people thought he was a Nazi. He and Joe Louis actually became really good friends, and Max Schmeling paid for Joe Louis's funeral when he died. And he was broke. So that just goes to show again how sport can bring things together that you would never think together. But this again was the story was Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling. U.S. versus Germany, black versus white, democracy versus Nazi. There's all these kind of layers to it that were opened up. It wasn't just like people thought about this. Journalists were writing about all these things. Now this started to become thing, and it kept the move to integration in different parts of America going. So very interesting. But most people don't know that about Max Schmeling if they've heard that fight, that they actually became pretty good friends. All right, we got Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio here. They were the next heroes. This was the era of World War II. The season before Pearl Harbor, Ted Williams hit 400, which is he was the last person to hit 400, and Joe DiMaggio had his famous 56-game hitting streak that captivated everybody, and it was the last real year of that first era of baseball because the war happened. We had Ted Williams was in. They both were in the war. Most of the star players went to the war. Can you imagine today? I mean, Ted Williams was in the war and in Korea and fought and survived a crash landing in the Korean War and came back and still played elite baseball for several more years after that. Joe DiMaggio was in the war. Hank Greenberg was in the war. Bob Feller, a lot of the Negro Leagues players that ended up being major league players, Jackie Robinson, Monty Irvin, they were in the war. Larry Doby. Can you imagine today if we had a war and some of the people either drafted or some of them were drafted, some of them volunteered? Ted Williams and Bob Feller volunteered immediately. The best hitter and the best pitcher. Can you imagine if we had a war today? I mean, that baseball was kind of the big thing. Joe Louis was in the military also. But can you imagine if the first people drafted, the first people that said, yes, we're going to go fight on the front lines of the war were LeBron James and Tom Brady? It's insane to think about. That's what happened is your entire group of elite athletes at the time, the boxers and the baseball players, because there was really not much else at the time. Football had started to go, but it wasn't the same thing. They're all there in the war, in the middle of the war. Ted Williams is flying planes. Bob Feller's trying to keep in shape pitching by running laps around the aircraft carrier between air raids in the Pacific. Like, this is like, those are just the stars. You guys, I mean, how many people, Warren Spahn, the best left-handed pitcher in the game, still the winningest left-handed pitcher in all baseball history. He got injured at the Battle of the Bulge. Like, Yogi Berra shot down one of our own planes. Only Yogi could do this, right? He was in the D-Day invasion, and he accidentally, but another plane went by. He shot both planes down, basically. The guy was okay. The pilot was okay. They fished him out, but not many people know that, but it could only happen to Yogi, right? I mean, like, I got our own guy too, but I got their guy too. So like, this is that's everybody back then. I mean, there was nobody immune to it. All the star players went. The game was very different. Also, it also really showed this was the spotlight time where people started to really see how great the Negro Leagues were and how great a pitcher Satchel Paige was, and how good Jackie Robinson was, and how good some of these other players were that were not allowed in the game. And the war really did a lot to solidify that was going to happen in baseball too. So Jackie Robinson on the right, the on the left is Wendell Smith, the writer. If you've seen the movie 42, you know who Wendell Smith is. He was the premier black newspaper, and I mean that not there used to be black newspapers. I don't mean that you know what I'm saying. He was the premier sports writer in black newspapers in the United States. And he traveled with Robinson. He pushed for integration, around he was the one that really started the charge around the time Joe Louis was fighting in the late 30s. And after Jesse Owens had his triumph, and he arranged tryouts. He was the one that arranged tryouts with the Red Sox. Jackie Robinson could have been on the Red Sox. They could have been the first to integrate, but they were by far the last. They could have had Ted Williams, Willie Mays. Willie Mays had a later tryout with them, and they did the same thing. They could have had Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays and Ted Williams all on the same team, which is just insane. So anyway, but that movie 42, if you haven't seen it, watch it. It's a little bit Hollywoodized, but all the stories of what happened are true. Some of them aren't in the same order of events. But that's all stuff that happened. And people don't realize too, Wendell Smith is covering Jackie Robinson, and once Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, Wendell Smith still couldn't sit in the press box. So he was writing he had his typewriter on his lap in the outfield, because he couldn't, the press boxes weren't integrated, which was just another thing that you don't think about until it happens, and this changed everything too, because everything became about the issue. This was the era of issue reporting, and obviously this was the greatest issue that we had in the United States at the time. And like I said, it wasn't just baseball, but it was the military. It was, obviously this is still Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, and Selma was 19 years later. This is the beginning of the civil rights, the modern civil rights movement. And it was obviously it was led by Jackie Robinson, but it was led by journalists who kept pushing for this. And it wasn't just black journalists either. Dick Young from the New York Post, one of the New York Post. He was a columnist for like 40 years there. He was an old white guy, but he was constantly pushing for integration in the game. He worked in New York. He'd seen all the Negro League teams come through. He knew they were talented, but he also knew it was right, and it takes, a lot of times it takes somebody else showing that, like a black journalist saying black players are good enough. Not everybody took a lot of merit in that, which, yes, you're trying to, that's favoritism, or that's you just trying to, throw some propaganda or whatever. But it took other people getting involved and other teams getting involved. There was before Jackie Robinson, Bill Veeck, who was the owner of the Cleveland Indians at the time, at the same time, actually, that Jackie Robinson signed with Brooklyn, he signed Larry Doby like a month and a half later, and then the next year signed Satchel Paige, and then in that year, 1948, they won the World Series. Cleveland, it's their last World Series, but they won it because they had black players on the team, and they were the first, besides Brooklyn, to really deal with it. Well, Bill Veeck tried to buy the Phillies in the 30s, and his plan was to hire Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson and a bunch of Negro League players, and then just beat the pants off all the major league guys. But somebody outed his idea to the commissioner, and they sold it to somebody else for less to keep it white. So that was a big strike against it. But man, can you imagine how that would have gone if that was the integration? There would have been a lot of mess. Their team would have been somehow, they would have figured out a way to just kick that team out of the league. It would have been a mess, but it would have been awesome too, because they would have just beat the pants off of everybody. So there wasn't enough journalists covering that part of the story though, because a lot of it was in secret. But that could have exploded in organized baseball's face if that was the case. So yeah, there's Jackie still. So and then the same thing. So now we're starting to add. You got the fairy tale. We talked about the fairy tale, and then we talked about the hero stuff, and then the issue stuff. That all kind of came into one with Jackie Robinson. Everybody wanted to know everything about Jackie Robinson. Everybody wanted it to be either really positive or really negative. People that wanted him to succeed wanted the coverage to be really positive. People that didn't want him to succeed wanted it to be really negative. He obviously played well enough and was a good man enough. Bad grammar there, but he was a good enough person that it was mostly pretty good coverage, because at least by the national newspapers, because he was winning, he was succeeding. What are you going to say? And again, most journalists were the ones, kind of thinking ahead at the time, and they knew this was coming, and that was it. So we had we had all aspects of that writing kind of came into play, and you'll see that keeps going as we move forward. This is Roger Kahn. He wrote the book Boys of Summer. He covered the Brooklyn Dodgers and Jackie Robinson. He was part of a group of writers in the 50s that became a little bit different. They rode with the teams. They traveled with the teams. The Brooklyn Dodgers paid for them to travel with the teams. The newspaper didn't pay. The teams paid. They paid for the 4 newspapers that covered them to travel with them, paid for their accommodations and their travel. And they traveled with the teams on the trains, on the buses, mostly trains. But imagine when you go from, the earlier parts that we're talking about of sports writing, now you're sitting next to Jackie Robinson on the train every day. Journalism changed big time in that regard, where you got all kinds of stories. Everybody that wanted to know anybody about anybody got the story, because there was no secrets on these trains, and they almost became pseudo part of the team because they were going to be there no matter what. And it was fair because the team paid all the newspaper beat writers to do this. So it wasn't like they were showing favoritism to one newspaper or the other, or one writer or the other. They said, hey, yep, we want the coverage. Let's go. But writers in the 50s got to know the athletes better than any other era. And it's still not like that. That was incredible for access and to get these kind of stories, but also on the flip side, they were too protective, because they had to. I have to sit next to Jackie Robinson every day on the train. If he got a DUI the night before, maybe I'm not reporting it since I have to sit next to him. I'm not saying that he did that. It's just an example. But you had that. I mean, that happened a little bit with Babe Ruth too. It's like there's a lot of negative stuff that could have been written about Babe Ruth that wasn't. But he was kind of, why would you want to? You would have the biggest story in the history of journalism about bringing Babe Ruth down, but then you would lose a million other big stories, So, but that was the kind of the thing in this group. Now they travel with the team, it was more of a buddy. You got great looks, great feature stories. You really got to know the players. But again, they were guarded. They guarded the player. The players didn't have to guard themselves. The writers guarded them because they didn't want to lose this access, and they didn't want to lose so many great stories by having having one. So one big one that was negative. So that was another different era of things. And I see Hard Times going some of a little faster. So anyway, these are some of the boys of summer. Um, the next group, Roger Maris on the left, Mickey Mantle on the right. They were going for their, they're trying to break Babe Ruth's record, 1961. They were both chasing. Roger Maris ended up breaking it. Mickey Mantle ended up coming a little bit short. Wild era in sports writing because there was like 8 full-time newspapers that covered the Yankees, and they kind of took sides on who they wanted to win, to who they wanted to break the record. So, some papers would be all lovey-dovey about Mickey Mantle and be bashing Roger Maris, and some people would be the opposite. And they both were sick of talking to everybody. What more can you say? Every day you're around all these reporters. Oh, you're going to break the record? Oh, you're going to break the record? You just asked me that yesterday. My answer hasn't changed. Shut up. Like if you can imagine, that would be insanely difficult to handle as a player, just the same questions over and over and over and over again. But they just added to things. You had the layer of, there were more games in the season in 1961 than when Babe Ruth had his 60 home runs. But then on the flip side, you also had air travel and different time zones and relief pitchers and different things you had to deal with. So there were so many story angles that came up, and they basically had to come up with, all the New York papers had to come up with a daily, from about the All-Star break on, they had to have like a daily piece that was different than all the other daily pieces they'd written every day about this. So it got very invasive on the players, and it just kind of changed. It was kind of the end of that this is 1961. It was kind of the end of that 50s, we're riding, we're with the team kind of a thing. And it just, you're digging now, and the stories came out, and like there were negative things that came out about Mickey Mantle and his drinking and carousing and everything like that. And stories that came out of that were just, crazy. And just then there were stories about what would you just look the other way with all of his, if you look the other way with all of Mickey Mantle's carousing, would you look the other way if it was a black guy carousing, stuff like that. You had all these kind of layers of what was going on, that just kind of kept going from there. Okay, now we're done with baseball for a little bit. So now we're at the same time here, we're late 50s into the 60s, and as we move forward here, things happen other places too, other sports thing. His is Bill Russell on the left, Red Auerbach, Celtics coach, on the right. Bill Russell was he wasn't the exact first, but he was the first star of the NBA that was black, and the greatest winner of all time. He has 11 championship rings. I mean, he doesn't even have 11 fingers, guys. That is insane. He is the only one that has 11 championship rings. And he changed the game. The game changed because he could defend, he could jump and do different things, and brought a different energy to the game, changed the game. So it was more defensive instead of just running back and forth. Can you imagine like the old Globetrotters cartoon or whatever, just running back and forth and everybody scoring and just boring. So he started swatting shots away, and everybody's looked at him like, wow, nobody's ever done that before. But he also, Jackie Robinson kind of started this, and it kept growing and growing. He also spoke out. He wasn't afraid to speak out. When stuff happened to him and his family, he spoke out. He was on a road trip. He bought a house in a mostly white neighborhood in Boston, and he was on a road trip. He came back. The house was torn to pieces, and there was human feces smeared all over his walls. And he didn't hide. For a lot of times people were embarrassed by that, when that happened to other people. I mean, it's awful, obviously. They didn't say anything because they didn't want to draw attention to it. And he stepped up and said things and started to change the way things were going. And Boston was known as a very racist city, and still still kind of has that moniker, not so much these days, but even like through 2000, like, Red Sox players will tell you, Bill Russell will tell, I mean, like it's the, which is funny. It's the furthest north city, but it just was so, um, compartmentalized. It was still a city that had ethnic neighborhoods and everything, and it just changed everything. But he started speaking out. Now we had the era, here's Jim Brown too, same thing in football. We had the era of athletes speaking out now. So now you have the spread of diversity through other sports, but you also have people like Bill Russell, like Jim Brown, like Will Chamberlain, like Kareem, that will speak up. And then that kind of all kind of came to fruition with the biggest speaker up athlete of all time, Muhammad Ali, who maybe spoke up a little too much. Maybe it was a little bit of an overcorrection, but he was, obviously pivotal. Muhammad Ali, I mean, just all the things he did. Can you imagine now? And just think of how we think of him now. Like people think of him as a hero now. And not just because he was a champion, but because he's got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was holding that torch at the Olympics, even though he had the Parkinson's and all this kind of stuff. Everybody wanted him dead when he first started boxing because he refused to enter the draft for Vietnam. And it was something that was so big, another story that was so big in sports that it started this era that we had for a while, and it still somewhat continues today, but it started where the biggest sports stories don't happen on the field or on the court or whatever. We have, a draft dodger, I guess, as that's a bigger story than his fighting, and he was the best fighter in the history of the planet. And we kind of had, well, that's a really small picture there, but that's Pete Rose. Pete Rose, that's Pete Rose's biggest story, not anything he did on the field, and he's the all-time hits leader. When he got busted for gambling and then banned for life from baseball, and that became the biggest story. And then OJ, does anybody really remember that? Nobody my age or younger remembers that OJ won the Heisman. I'll tell you that. This is how I remember listening to this trial in my 8th grade history class every day. And so it just changed everything. The biggest stories became stuff that happened outside the game, not inside the game. Kobe Bryant with his trial too. We had his rape trial. He was acquitted, but it still was bigger. And then the way he died. I'm right. I mean, like those two things to me, as more people remember those than his 81-point game, or something like that. So the biggest thing became, the stories became the bigger outside, and now it's about finding that balance. Now we turn to you don't want to have that. I as a sports writer I don't want to live in a world where all my biggest stories are not happening on the field. Don't get me wrong, we need some of those things, and we need a good blend of things, but that's very different now. And then very different with sports writers now here too. We got, pardon the interruption, I'm sure some of you guys have seen that show. Tony Kornheiser on the left, Michael Wilbon on the right. These are sports columnists, nationally syndicated sports columnists that now have TV shows. And then Around the Horn is another one that's on that. They're on back-to-back on ESPN. These are examples of now writers have their own brand now. That is something that is very new. When you had Roger Kahn that was covering Jackie Robinson, you wanted to beat other guys to the stories, but the stories were still, nobody cared. The readers themselves, nobody cared who wrote it. They know that, that the Post beat the news on this story or whatever, but it wasn't the same thing. Now people follow writers, and writers are on TV now. They get to give a lot more opinion, and it's a different brand now, where you have writers having their own voice that's not just in their work as either as a newspaper person or a magazine person or a broadcaster. They get to give their opinion. Any podcasts, TV shows, everything is out there, and you know, just about every national writer has something like that. So now, you know, it's the challenge now is trying to balance all of these things. There's so many layers of what's happened. You know, you don't sports still have the fairy tale feeling, but you don't want to write it like a fairy tale, right? They still have it still has the in-depth off the court stuff. You still don't want that to dominate what you're doing. You still want, you know, you want to be able to give your opinion, but you don't want it to go too far and dominate you don't want your voice to dominate what the story is. There's so every layer that we talked about is now stuff that we're trying to come up with to find a balance and what those stories are and how to tell them. And it's been a lot different. I barely had typing into a computer when I was a freelancer at the Ann Arbor News, and I had to go into their system at their office and type it right there. I didn't have a laptop, or I couldn't do it remotely. There was no Wi-Fi, all kinds of craziness. So, yeah, so it took a long time to get to this point where we have all of these things blended. And I'm sure that in the next 20 years, there'll be another layer to this, where we kind of have to adjust and keep blending. So, that's all I got. I want to leave some time for questions. If you have any questions about anything talked about, or about just the different technology that's gone through things, or different challenges or whatever, I am more than happy to answer them. Okay,
Here,
Tom's there'll be one right there too. Yeah,
So you could probably talk all day on this, but
probably.
I'm in your primary form of your own work is through the paper, through the set. And I'm old school enough to appreciate that form of where I get a lot, still prefer to get a lot of
Awesome.
my information. Yeah. Can you express any kind of personal frustration, or in this era of social media and what you were just pointing out there with PTI and all that that you can still get some self-satisfaction out of doing what you do to some degree in print?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So social, yeah, I didn't really get into social media because I could go off on a tangent than just the last days. It would last as long as a cricket match. Social media is the best and worst thing that's happened to media. It's good because it connects people. So people, like, if I write a story about Hope College here, somebody that lives in California that went to Hope College can find it. Stuff like that. But it created a really tough era of journalism these last 10 years or so, where it was the fight to be first, because whatever's on line first and what's on Twitter first, X, Twitter, whatever's on social media first is a lot of times what gets looked at first. So we, as an industry, struggled with is it best to be first, or is it best to be right? And we always wanted to be right, but it's really more the best to be first, or the best to be fully and completely all details right. And that is very difficult. That was very difficult. It's not quite as big of an issue in the sports world as it is in news. But it very much is, where especially if you have competing things, and it's a big issue in big markets, especially where they're trying to, is Tom Brady retired? Is he not retired? Is he retired? Is he not retired? Oh, he's going to Tampa. No, he's staying. Stuff like that. Everybody wants that big story first, but like that creates a lot of issues where you're working so hard to be first that you might, I don't think I've ever gone so fast that I've been inaccurate, but I've definitely gone so fast that there's been pieces left out, if that makes sense, to get that up first. Now you get those things and you add to it, but maybe the people who see that story first don't go back and read it with all the details in it too. So that there's definitely a struggle there because, you want to make sure that you want to be first, but you also want to make sure that you're completely accurate. And I would say that it's finally tilted back to realizing all the dangers of that with lawsuits and whatever. Again, mostly things that happen in bigger markets when you're competing with somebody. Right now, I mean, in Holland, I don't really have to compete for the most part with stuff. The Grand Rapids Press does some stuff, but they got their own, you know what I mean, their own stuff to deal with. And it's not like it used to be where they had a Lakeshore Bureau that was, right across this, where are we? Over here. And where we were sitting in the press box with them all the time. That was different time. But yeah, social media has it ups the pressure with a lot of things. And also we have to, when it just was print, almost everybody got the paper and you just got what you got. Now we measure how much web traffic we get on each story every day. We get a report, what's doing well, what kind of stories aren't, which helps us decide which ones to go with. But it's also, difficult to try to deal with that as well too. But we also have to tell people now, like now that it's online and there's so many online news sources and there's also so many online news sources that it's not just, especially with the younger generation that doesn't necessarily have the print, you don't just do a story and leave it. No one will see it. You have to put it on social media and be like, here's what we did, guys, read it, and that is so annoying. In general to have to feel like we have to do that, but we do, because that's the only way, that gets to people. So my pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.
My turn. I recently read an article, and I believe it was in the Holland Sentinel, and we're digital subscribers.
Awesome.
And I'm sorry, I can't remember what the article was on, but it was something local here in Holland.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, and I read the byline at the end, and it said it was written by a person out of the Petoskey News, assisted by AI. And you were talking about the next level. I'm just wondering where you're going to go with sports on that.
For sure. Well, first I will address the Petoskey part of that. So the Holland Sentinel's in the USA Today network, for those of you who don't know. It's Gannett is the company, but the USA Today is the flagship. The Detroit Free Press is in our company, the Lansing State Journal is in our company, and 19 other papers in Michigan in our company. And I have the pleasure and opposite of pleasure of being the sports editor of the sports editors of those 19. Detroit, besides Detroit and Lansing, they got lots of people, they're Metro, they're whatever. So, but our news person is the same for some of the other things. So we operate very much as a network. So that's where a lot of that comes into play. A lot of the stuff that I write has gone into other, Detroit and stuff, whatever like that. But I know your question is more about AI. So AI is a real thing, and this is going to have to be handled very delicately. We are starting to use it, as you see, in our company. It's more for not the writing part, but like numbers eval and stuff like that. I don't know exactly what that story was, but like for sports, we're talking about it nationally, is there a way in our network to have a program that using AI that can like change a Hope College basketball box score into like 150 word story. Now we won't do that for Hope, but it's supposed to be for the extra stuff. So like, like the Free Press, for example, they'll handle their Detroit stuff, but it might be worth their investment in AI to have an algorithm that produces that 150 word recap for like Western Michigan football and Central Michigan football and Eastern Michigan football, stuff that they don't cover. That's where we're at for sports. Stuff like that is And it's, of course, the scary part is, when robots take over the world, where's our jobs going to be, right? But it's supposed to be only in the, the right word is, but like periphery, if that makes sense, stuff that's saving us time so we can do our writing better. That's the goal. Don't mistake me when I say every journalist has got that scary thought in the back of our heads about some of that stuff. But out of all of our papers, we're pretty much all down to one person on the sports side of things. So when I started here, we had 5 20 years ago, and now we have just me and a couple of freelancers. So they can't really get rid of more of us at this point. So that is one. So we've already had to deal with that part of it. But yeah, definitely, that is going to be one of the major issues over the next 5-6 years on how that gets used. Does it really work? Is it accurate? And does it really allow us more time to do our other stuff better? That's the goal. But
Okay.
yeah. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
Imagine in your position, doing local sports. You have enemies and you have people who just relish what you do. How do you determine what stories to run? That's question number 1.
Okay.
Question number 2 is every once in a while you'll rank, or someone ranks the swimmers in the area as the top ones, or that. Do you ever get a lot of flack from all that, or
Yeah.
how do you handle that, I guess?
Okay. So first part, how do we pick stories, right? Now a lot of it comes with experience now. I would have been really awful at it probably when we first started. But now, especially with one person instead of 5, things are changed. When we had 5 people, it was go out and find stuff. Where you're going to go to this game, you're going to go to this game, we're going to find whatever. Everybody writes short except the person that gets the best story. Then you know what I mean. And we try, go, and that's how it was daily. Now you have to know ahead of time mostly what the story could be outside of football, I guess, maybe high school football stuff. But I have to use those numbers because the people who get the print, God bless you, that you get what you get. It's whatever's in there. It's usually a day late now because of our deadlines and having all 19 of those papers printed in the same 2 places. So I need to look at trends of what is, what's best for the paper, where I can use my freelance money, how many things to go to. Can I write this without going? What things do we need photos of? Stuff like that. So it takes a lot to like kind of figure that out. I mean, obviously I've been here 20 years now, so I know what's usually when the big things are coming, but like different trends, different things. This year, Hope football is undefeated. And my Grand Valley football coverage is completely kicking Hope's butt as far as number of viewers. Now, last year when Hope wasn't quite as good as they were now, Hope, they were pretty even last year, and 2 years ago, Hope was much better than Grand Valley, and now Grand Valley numbers are much better than Hope. Now, don't get me wrong, we're still at a point where we're covering both of them, but if they told me I could only cover one and you have no more freelance budget, I'm going to Grand Valley because I'm getting a lot more than that, and there's a lot less game coverage too, if you notice. I mean, a lot of it is, kind of features on kids that the game gets woven into, like I might go to, I will always still go to as many Holland versus Holland Christian events, Zeeland East versus Zeeland West, Saugatuck versus Fenville, Hope versus Calvin. They have major things, but then you try to get feature stories and stuff out of some of those events. And then if people are really good that aren't involved in those, you try to do more feature stories on the kid or the team or whatever than game stories, because people don't really read the game stuff. They used to tell us when it was mostly, when people get their stuff from print, is that you're writing for the people that weren't there. Now we're writing for the people that were there. So we need to go deeper, either features, analysis, whatever, because if I have a story about West Ottawa online, a lot of the kids, the readers from Saugatuck Federal, they don't give a crap. They're not going to click on it unless something crazy happens, you know. So it's a matter of writing for the audience that was there now, which changes the way we kind of do things. And the second part of your question, picking and ranking things. Oh yeah, I get flack all the time. All the time. Not from these people. Their daughter was our volleyball player of the year one year. No flack from them. On that call. Yeah, I usually get it, you know, and it's usually the dumbest. Some of it's usually like picking one kid over another for like the last spot on the team, you know, like I rarely get any flack for who was the player of the year. But if we do like we do all area teams and stuff like that. Yeah. Why wasn't my kid on there? Well, your kid would have been the last one. You know, it's not like that, you know, but I definitely get that a lot. Just comes to the territory, you know, you just gotta, it makes me make sure I have evidence and reason. I don't ever just say that's it. If I have an open virtual door, we don't have an office right now. I don't have an office. Policy where if you want to complain to me, that's fine. I usually try not to talk to people that complain really loud or whatever. But if somebody wonders why something is, I'll tell them. And I make sure that when I pick those, there's a reason. There's the cutoff is this, or this is what happened, or this is what happened, because I've anticipated all the flack that I've gotten over the years too. But it's definitely a real thing. And as long as you can defend it, nobody has to like it. But I got to live with it. You know, I got to be what's fair in my mind to the kids. It's not all conference. It's my pick, really. I mean, so especially now that it's just me, I can't be like, that's what the staff voted. Just me. I honestly do still say that because we've got a couple of freelancers, but you know, so you guys know the secret on that one. What was that? Oh, prediction on the Hope Calvin game, first football game. Hope by a lot. I don't know about 50, but 28. You know, so that'll be fun though. That's another layer. That's another layer of story. That's great for me because everybody's going to want to read that. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so with the seasons seemingly expanding, like, you know, so baseball still's going on and hockey has already started, basketball started, football's going on. And then we've got more sports now than we had, say, 60 years ago. You know, gosh, we might have professional cricket somewhere in the US and that'll filter down to the high school, or we've got lacrosse and
Right.
Lord knows what. How do you keep up with all the different sports to report?
It's tough. It's very tough. The springtime is tougher in that regard because there's more sports in the spring. There's like almost double the amount of sports. Like I have between our high school, we have 10 high schools that we cover, and then we've got Hope and Grand Valley stuff. There are 104 teams that I cover in the spring. There's no way I get to 104 things. So that has actually helped make me pick and choose better in the spring. But like fall has football and winter has basketball. So they have their different focal points, you know, where we have that. High school baseball does not have the same cachet that basketball and football do. I would say even track has it better in the spring. But it's about finding the story, you know, like we're obviously going to always have a good amount of football and basketball coverage, but it's about finding the kid that's doing the story behind the story. Even is I rely a lot on coaches. We do, if you guys get the center to see, we do a top performers each week. There's a football one and a non-football one. The only reason I know any of that is because coaches email their stuff in still. So that's where I get most of that information from. And then that allows me to see who's trending basically, you know, and then you want to try to get, you know, story on them while they're doing well. And, you got to pick and choose, you know, like if there's, I'm not going to write more than two, let's see, if I do a players to watch and the all area team and who made the state, that's 3 golf stories, you know, like in a fall girls golf. We had one kid make the state tournament. I'm going to write obviously a lot less on that than cross country, where we have 75 runners going to state this Saturday. And 3 teams that could win out of 8. There's 4 divisions and 2 genders. That's 8 teams. We might have 3 team champions and 2 individual champions. So obviously going to be focused more on that. So it's a matter of you know, reaching out to the coaches ahead of the season too, and you know, remembering who was on all your teams helped me so much, because then I know who's coming back, you know, so I know where some of the elite athletes are going to be each time, and then you know, you kind of pick up some trends.
Or just quick question.
Sure.
So being a good Sentinel reader online,
God bless you.
how do I know? I mean, I just go scroll, and I can look at, do I actually have to click on that for my eyes to be caught as reading that article?
Yes,
Okay.
you have to click on it.
So, so if I'm just looking at the page online and I can read it, that's not counting.
You have to click the story. No, like if you're looking, scroll through, you just have to click the story. That counts. But like if you're just on the page scrolling, that doesn't count.
Okay.
So
I'll need some practice.
that's all right. I told this is a funny story about that. I told the Hope swimming coach. I said, if you want me to be here more than wrestling, you guys got to get the hits. And so they have a social media person for one of their swimmers is assigned to do their social media. So they put out all our stories, and he is assigned that all the swimmers need to at least click on the story and send it to their parents. And it just doing that, it's kicking the wrestling coverage's butt. So I don't know if the coach is really just sitting there going click, 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 but whatever works. So
It's after 2:30. And so we have to wind it up,
Sure.
I think. And Dan, thank you so much for
My
being
pleasure.
here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's give a round of applause for his presentation. Now, if you're going to stick around.
I'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody's got any other questions or.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We started there in 2008.